The church fell silent when the preacher stopped mid-ceremony. He had seen something in the bride's eyes, something so strange, so terrifying, that he refused to pronounce them husband and wife. What he revealed next shocked the entire town. It was a golden morning in the small town of Rosewood, a place where everyone knew everyone and weddings were not just family affairs but community celebrations. The church was decorated with fresh lilies and roses, white ribbons hung across the pews, and the smell of polished wood and candles filled the air. The bride, Eleanor, was the talk of the town, a beautiful young woman in her mid-20s, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away in an accident. She was known for her kindness, her soft-spoken nature, and her quiet resilience. The groom, Thomas, was a wealthy businessman who had swept Eleanor off her feet just 6 months earlier. He was charming, confident, and generous, though many whispered that his charm often felt too rehearsed, his smiles too perfect. But Eleanor had fallen for him quickly, and Thomas seemed determined to marry her as fast as possible. The church bells rang as the guests took their seats, their murmurs filling the hall with anticipation. Reverend Matthews, an elderly preacher who had served the town for decades, stood by the altar with his well-worn Bible in hand. He was a man respected by all, not only for his sermons but for his uncanny ability to see through people's hearts. As Eleanor walked down the aisle in her white gown, her veil flowing like a river of light, everyone rose to their feet. The organ music soared, and Thomas, standing tall in his black suit, looked every bit the proud groom. Yet, as Eleanor approached, Reverend Matthews noticed something strange. Her steps faltered ever so slightly, as though she was hesitant, her eyes hidden beneath the veil, not fixed on Thomas but scanning the crowd nervously. When she reached the altar and placed her hand in Thomas's, Matthews leaned closer, expecting to see joy glowing in her face. Instead, he caught the faintest glimpse of fear. Her fingers trembled in his, not from excitement but something deeper. The preacher, experienced in uniting hundreds of couples, felt a heaviness in his chest. He knew when a bride was overwhelmed with joy and when one was drowning in silence. And Eleanor, the gentle girl he had seen grow up in the town, was clearly hiding something. The ceremony began, but Matthew's eyes kept darting between the couple, observing their expressions carefully. When he recited the vows, Thomas repeated them with a voice that rang loud and proud, while Eleanor's answers came out barely audible, her lips moving as though forced. It was not shyness, he knew Eleanor, and while she was quiet, she was never this lifeless. And then it happened, the moment that froze the air in the church. As Matthews asked if anyone had any objections, Eleanor flinched, her body stiffening as though she expected someone to rise. No one did, yet she lowered her head, and a tear slipped beneath her veil. Matthew's heart pounded. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He could feel it in the silence of the church, in the nervous whispers of the wind through the stained glass windows. And though every guest expected him to pronounce the couple husband and wife, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He could not ignore what he had seen. Not today. Not with this bride. Reverend Matthews was a man of faith, but also of conscience. He had officiated weddings where couples radiated happiness, their eyes locked with unshakable trust. But Eleanor's gaze remained lowered, and her shoulders hunched as though bearing an invisible chain. As he continued the ceremony, his voice wavered, not from age but from doubt. He looked at Thomas, who gripped Eleanor's hand a little too tightly, his smile stretched wide but his eyes sharp with a strange possessiveness. Matthews knew the town's gossip. Some said Thomas had made his fortune too quickly, others whispered about business dealings shrouded in secrecy. He had dismissed it before, but now he wondered if Eleanor had rushed into something she did not understand. He asked Eleanor again if she took Thomas as her lawful husband, giving her a chance to speak with her heart. But Eleanor's lips barely moved, her voice cracked, and instead of saying, "I do," she coughed, stuttered, and finally whispered something Matthews almost didn't catch, "Do I have a choice?" The words were so soft they were nearly lost beneath the rustle of gowns and suits, but they struck Matthews like thunder. His old hands tightened around the Bible. He paused, looking at her sharply. Thomas's face twitched, his grip tightening further on Eleanor's hand, his eyes flashing a warning beneath his perfect smile. The guests shifted, some noticing the hesitation, others whispering in confusion. Matthews cleared his throat, masking his unease, and gently placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Child, are you here of your own will?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing, meant only for her ears. Eleanor's breath hitched, and for a moment, her eyes lifted to meet his. Behind the veil, he saw the truth, her pupils wide with fear, her lips trembling, her soul screaming for help. Matthew's heart sank. He realized then that the wedding was not a celebration but a cage. Something in Eleanor's life had forced her into this union, and she was too frightened to speak it aloud. But as the preacher stood there, torn between duty and conscience, he knew the burden of truth was his to bear. He could let the vows continue, pronounce the marriage, and live with the knowledge that he had delivered a lamb into the hands of a wolf. Or he could stop everything, risk humiliation, anger, and scandal, to save her. He glanced at the crowd, friends, family, the entire town watching expectantly. Then he looked at Thomas, whose smile no longer reached his eyes. And then at Eleanor, who was silently begging him with a single tear rolling down her cheek. Matthews closed the Bible slowly. The church fell silent, the music stopped, and the guests leaned forward. In a steady voice that carried across the hall, he said, "This wedding cannot continue." "Not today." Gasps echoed. Thomas's smile shattered into shock and fury. Eleanor's hands dropped to her sides, trembling. The town was in uproar, but Matthews knew there was no turning back. He had seen the truth, and he could not let it be buried beneath vows that were never free. The church erupted into whispers and protests. Guests looked at one another, shocked beyond measure. Some stood, demanding an explanation. Others turned their eyes to Eleanor, who stood frozen like a porcelain doll about to shatter. Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger, his voice booming. "Reverend, this is absurd. How dare you humiliate us in front of everyone?" His hand shot out, gripping Eleanor's arm so tightly she winced. Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Release her, Thomas. A marriage is not built on fear." The groom sneered, trying to mask his fury with charm. "She's just nervous, Reverend. You know how brides can be. This is her dream day, and you're turning it into a nightmare." But Matthews stood firm, raising his hand for silence. "Eleanor," he said, his voice echoing in the hushed church, "do you wish to marry this man? Speak freely, child, for here, before God, no one can silence you." The entire church held its breath. Eleanor trembled, her lips quivering as though the words would not come. Thomas's grip tightened, his smile brittle, his eyes shooting daggers. Then, as though a floodgate burst inside her, Eleanor pulled back her veil with trembling fingers. Gasps filled the air as her pale, tear-streaked face was revealed. "I never wanted this," she cried, her voice breaking yet strong enough to reach every ear. "He forced me. He threatened my grandmother, said he'd take everything if I didn't marry him. I thought I had no choice." A silence like death fell over the church, broken only by Eleanor's sobs. The townspeople murmured, outrage and disbelief rippling through the crowd. Thomas's mask fell completely now, his face twisted with rage. "She lies," he bellowed. "Do you think I need to force a woman to marry me? Look at her, she's nothing without me." But the damage was done. Eleanor's courage had sparked a fire. Her childhood friends stood, her grandmother wept, the townsfolk who adored Eleanor rose in anger against Thomas. And Reverend Matthews, his old hands shaking yet steady in faith, declared, "This is no wedding, it is a prison. And by God's authority, I will not bind chains in the name of holy matrimony." The congregation roared, some rushing to comfort Eleanor, others stepping forward to block Thomas. For the first time, Eleanor felt the chains loosen. The town she thought would abandon her was now her shield. And Thomas, stripped of his power, found himself surrounded not by admirers but by a community ready to defend the innocent. The wedding was over, not in celebration but in liberation. Thomas was escorted out of the church, his protests drowned by the voices of townsfolk who vowed to protect Eleanor and her grandmother. Some spoke of reporting his threats, others of investigating his shady business dealings. His empire of fear was crumbling in the very place he thought would secure his control. Eleanor, though shaken, felt as though she could breathe for the first time in months. Her veil lay discarded on the floor, her tears wiped away by the loving hands of friends and family. Reverend Matthews stood beside her, his voice gentle as he said, "Child, marriage is sacred, but only when it is chosen with a free heart. You owe no one your silence." Eleanor embraced her grandmother tightly, whispering apologies, but the old woman only stroked her hair and said, "You are safe now, my darling. That's all that matters. The story of that day spread beyond Rosewood. It became a tale told in towns and villages, of the preacher who stopped a wedding not out of pride or scandal but because he saw what others refused to see, the truth in a bride's eyes. Eleanor eventually rebuilt her life, pursuing her dreams without fear. She discovered her strength, her voice, and her worth. And though she carried the scars of that near prison, she also carried the memory of a town that chose justice over appearances, and a preacher who valued freedom over ceremony. Reverend Matthews continued his work, older and slower with each year, but his story became legend. When asked why he dared to stop that wedding, he would smile softly and say, "Because sometimes, God doesn't whisper, He shows you the truth in plain sight. And if you have the courage to see it, you must also have the courage to act." And so, the tale lived on, a warning, a lesson, and a beacon. That love cannot be forced, vows cannot be chains, and silence in the face of injustice is the loudest betrayal of all. Don't let this story end here. If this tale touched your heart, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more powerful folktale stories that reveal hidden truths and life-changing lessons. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story that could change the way you see the world.